Good evening, everyone. I'm Dibyesh. Let me invite you and welcome you all on behalf of University of Westminster to School of Social Sciences Festival. That's a 2-day-long festival which we have today and tomorrow. We have more events tomorrow, so please check those things out. Of course, we are here for the panel, and I'm inviting you as head of school. So I'm head of School of Social Sciences. This is part of my school, but I'm also here as the co-chair of university's EDI committee. EDI, which all of you would know, it's quite a tricky concept, but equality, diversity, inclusion. I hope my approach to EDI is quite different from what people usually have come to expect with EDI, which is a tick box exercise. Right? But let's discuss that. I'm part of the panel, we'll discuss later. But at our university, we are very serious about decolonizing and diversifying both. If you notice, many institutions talk of decolonizing, not necessarily diversifying, with the idea that we don't want diversity, we want decolonizing, because diversity can be a tick box thing. And the rationale for why we have both decolonizing and diversifying at our university, and I can share that secret with you, is that when we had that discussion, we also acknowledged that decolonization can become a trendy language and vocabulary, also for those from dominant identities to be radical, for virtue signaling, while ignoring the fact that the way in which they interact in everyday life with racialized minorities, for instance, might go unreconstructed. So the idea is, what do we do if we have got Homi Bhabha and Edward Syed and few other, okay, Homi Bhabha is still alive, so I can't say dead men, but let's say 3-4 male figures. Is decolonizing something that can rely upon, let's say, only male authors or not? So we wanted to therefore keep both decolonizing and diversifying. That's a broader ethos within the university and within the school. This school is going to be 5th year of our School of Social Sciences. We became colleagues, David and I, who I'll introduce David, he's the main person here. The main person are the 2 guests, but David is the main person as organizer. We started working, and Catherine, there's another colleague of mine. We started working exactly 5 years ago, by the way. Officially, it was 1st August 2018, but it's in May when things were clear that we will become a school. So psychology, sociology, politics, and international relations. And from very beginning, what brought us together, of course, was we were put together, but also we came together because there was a strong commitment amongst many, not all, not surprising, for many to diversify the experience for the students, but also for academic colleagues. So from very beginning, diversification has been a crucial part of it, and decolonizing part and part. So that's a broader theme. But we do welcome those. How many of you are from outside the university? So a few of you, yes. So if it's first time for you, great. We have a lot of events going on constantly because we do believe that you can't only take action, you need conversation, but conversation is not enough on themselves, we also need action. So for instance, I can even give you a plug for a conference that's taking place on 11th of May. It's in this very venue, challenging racisms in higher education and beyond. It will deal with issues of anti-black racism, anti-Semitism as racism, Islamophobia as racism, casteism as racism, and various other issues. So we do keep doing various events at our university because we do believe that conversations are important. That's a very long introduction for me, by the way, and I was not supposed to do that. I was just supposed to welcome you to our university and make sure you feel welcomed here and pass it on to David Khabaz. David.
Thank you, Dibyesh. That was really lovely. That's the opening statement. As Dibyesh said, our endeavor in this university is to have a constructive dialogue about decolonization, and that's the reason why I have been hassling this gentleman and Riadh and of course other scholars sitting in this panel to actually come here and talk about this very important, I would say, revolutionary idea in universities that has been taking place for a number of years. Now, what I want us to think about tonight is to actually think about two current discourses which are in parallel with each other in terms of what is decolonization, and that's the title of this particular event. And what I want us to think about is how do we take this process forward, and how to have a constructive dialogue about decolonization to make sure that the actual process stays alive and goes beyond the parameter of universities and actually capture the public imagination. This is what I want us to talk about today. Just very briefly, just to put all this talk in the context of what we're going to talk about tonight. I prepared a few slides that I want to talk about here. Let me just quickly click on this slide here, if it goes on. Right, okay. Now, I wonder what people think, talk about when they think about what decolonization is. One of the most important definitions that I found it comes from SOAS, the decolonizing group in SOAS. This particular Mira is a very active person in this field, and she has actually defined decolonizing in three separate stages, the three separate contexts. Decolonizing means to look at our shared assumptions about how the world is today, or the discussions about the inequality, persisting inequality in the world, or the discussion about the persisting injustice in the world, and so on. That is one essential element of decolonization. The second element that Mira talks about in some of our discussions, and that decolonization or decolonizing asks the crucial questions about the relationship between the location and identity of the author, of the person, where the research or knowledge comes from, who is involved in the process of the knowledge producing process, and how those author of the research and the people who are researched are actually kind of combined in the process of the knowledge producing, or what is knowledge produced through the research process. And the third element that Mira talks about is decolonizing asks us to think about implications of a more diverse student body in terms of pedagogy and achievement. I think this is one of the things that we are concentrating in this university very much. So I wonder if Dibyesh would agree with that, and that we are thinking at this element as a very important element of instilling the decolonizing process in our university, in terms of making sure that our students catch up with the rest of the student body in terms of achievement. So those three definitions is really within the academic discourse. I would say that is neatly captures what decolonization is about. Now, if I go a little bit further, and I look at the media kind of discourse, I see something totally different. I see that particularly tabloid, you know that we have a very opinionated, very aggressive, very active tabloid sector in this country. And they have been kind of involved in this process, kind of getting involved with the idea of decolonization. And they have come up with some unbelievable adjectives, if you like, in terms of, what is decolonization. Of course, my idea here is to engage our students in terms of their understanding of what decolonization is. And some of the responses that I get from them for those students, there's inequality and injustice, historic inaccuracy, rethinking education, refusal, resistance, unlearning, and so on and so forth, that our students have taken on board from the academic teaching, from the teaching that we have in kind of process in this university. So their kind of application of decolonization, it really captures these ideas. Now, if I go a little bit forward, now I get what I was telling you about the different kind of discourse in this country. And you get the tabloid or general media discourse about decolonization. What I see in the tabloid, and I'll just try to engage with the tabloid discourse about decolonization, I see they call us cultural Taliban, misused, the idea as misused. They kind of coined the process of decolonization as ideological indoctrination. They, particularly Daily Mail and The Sun, and of course to some extent the BBC and other the other sort of quality sector has been involved in this kind of debate and discourse. Some have called the colonization as assault on academic freedom. Some they call it as politicizing education. Some call it, I'm not sure what it means. A lot of people have actually said that. So with that, if I just give you another example of this particular idea, you will see that from this discourse, from the media discourse, we get kind of ideas that particular government minister says that education ministers in the I think it was Boris Johnson's government that said that he completely rubbishes the call to decolonize the curriculum, insisting it would never happen, or it would do nothing to the society. That was his particular angle. But of course, Daily Mail goes on to talk about the cultural Taliban, the quotes about the woke brigade have hijacked academia, and of course, not only the tabloid sector, you get a kind of sense that this kind of debate has reached The Guardian as well. I see a piece by Kenan Malik that he argued about our students, so as students, right to decolonize their minds from Western philosophers. And he goes on to talk about that this is something that we need to talk and debate in terms of if philosophy is all about, Western philosophy is all about male, pale, and stale, that this process needs to be reopened to a kind of a debate to the wider public. Now, with Kenan Malik, I don't know if you ever heard Jonathan Israel, who has talked about the origins of Western thinking about injustice, about racism, about colonial power, and so on. And Jonathan Israel argues that he says there is a strong case for studying non-European tradition as an essential part of any university teaching course, but such a global view began in radical enlightenment itself. So he actually points out to this idea that we need to rethink about the radical enlightenment in 16th and 17th century. And he goes on to say many radical enlighteners believe that the anti-Christian naturalism had powerful roots in medieval Islamic philosophy. So to a certain extent, what Kenan Malik in The Guardian had argued, that to talk about decolonizing as we need to completely disown all the traditional, the Western philosophical tradition, Western knowledge completely, is a kind of an idea that we need to rethink, we need to reevaluate in the process of having a great dialogue, having shall we, constructive dialogue about what is decolonization and where is the process taking us. Now, if I go a little bit forward, now I want to take your attention in terms of one of the recent research done with the general public on the views on decolonizing curriculum. We see that the think tank, the UPP, the Foundation of Higher Education Policy, they conducted a survey. And they actually have come up with an interesting results with the general public's view about decolonization. Now, what they say here, really, their survey says that the actual survey shows that the people are largely hostile. The general public seem to be largely hostile to or in two minds about decolonizing the curriculum. 31% of their surveys, with about 2,500 people involved in the survey, 31% of the people disagreed completely with it. They did not want to have anything to do with decolonizing the curriculum. 30% neither agree or disagree, 33%, and only 20% of the public had actually agreed that decolonizing the curriculum is a good thing to do. So if that is taken on board, we have to think about broadening the ideas about curriculum, broadening the ideas of engaging with the public, and thinking about the kind of issues that general public will warm up to when it comes to decolonization. The findings essentially suggest that university can find widespread public support while implementing changes to the curriculum if they are presented thoughtfully. This is something that I want our panel to talk about today. What are these thoughtful ideas about actually taking the process forward? If, again, just going forward with this idea that the director of the UPP, the director of Universities Partnership, is an independent think tank, that what he says is quite profound, I think. He says, at times, it feels like universities are in the middle of a never-ending cultural war with protagonists from both sides stoking division and polarization. But as our polling suggests, this particular poll that I just showed you, the way we talk about contentious issues such as decolonisation can narrow or broaden appeal. He goes on to say, this is an important lesson. There are gaps in support for the sector based on voting intention, age and class. If these gaps widen, universities will face a difficult future, a difficult process in the future. And fundamentally, to grow public support, what he argues is we need to demonstrate our worth to people, to general public, who do not typically engage with universities. That means adopting approaches which essentially persuade our ideas, linking our actions to their values. I think this is a very important point, again, that I want our panel to think about. Now, that's enough for me. I'll just set the agenda in terms of what I want us to discuss today. So now is the introduction of people who are in the panel. Dr. Leon Moosavi is a great friend of mine. We've been, I hope you don't mind this picture, Leon.
What my face looks like.
Leon is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Social Policy, and Criminology at University of Liverpool. His research interests broadly relate to the sociology of race and religion. He also has a specific interest in the sociology of knowledge and epistemic decolonisation. In fact, I'm a member of his platform that Leon is. He founded the colonial critique, which is a global network which has more than 1,800 scholars, students, and activists who have an interest in the theoretical as well as the applied approaches to coloniality, decoloniality within and beyond the university. That's Leon's introduction, and it's really a great pleasure to have you here, Leon. Now, my other friend, Dr. Riadh Ghemmour, is also very active in this field. With a PhD in education from University of Exeter, Riadh is the Learning Skill Coordinator at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London. He is also an education consultant working for May Education Consultancy, which provides trainings and coaching sessions on matters related to diversity, inclusion, equity, and social justice. Riadh is the co-founder of the Colonial Dialogues, an online platform that was established in 2020 to advance critical conversations about decoloniality. Riadh's current project is turned to his PhD into a published book. How far have you got to that, Riadh?
I'm still working on the proposal.
Looking forward
to stages.
Yeah, thank you. We'll be looking at the intersection of coloniality and power in research and education. Going forward is Professor Catherine Loveday. We have the pleasure of having Catherine here. Catherine has been at the University of Westminster for over 30 years and is a strong advocate of Westminster's progressive, inclusive, compassionate and outward-facing ethos. Her research focuses on the foundation of human memory and in particular the way that memories are formed, accessed and lost. She has also explored the effects of cultural amnesia and argues that well-being relies on having an accessible and authentic history, both personal and collective. Catherine is passionate about encouraging public engagement with science, appearing regularly at festivals, as well as writing for the media and making regular appearances on BBC Radio 4's, which I have been listening to. Catherine, amazing program sometimes. It's called All in the Mind, and many other radio and TV programs. Catherine is a member of the university's BME group, a BME network, and is committed to anti-racism both within the university and in the wider society. Catherine's recent conversation with John Amiachi, OBE, launched Westminster's Black History Year. Finally, Professor Dibyesh Anand is the head of the School of Social Science at the University of Westminster. He is the author of monographs Geopolitical Exotica, Tibet in Western Imagination, and Hindu Nationalism in India, and The Politics of Fear. Dibyesh has spoken about and published extensively on various topics, including post-colonial politics and international relations, Tibet, China, India border dispute, Hindu nationalism, and Islamophobia. He is the co-chair of the Westminster's BME network and university's EDI committee. Dibyesh identifies as queer in personal and political terms. This is our panel. Please give him a round of applause. Now, guys, with that introduction, I invite our member of panels for 10 minutes or 10 or 15 minutes space of talk time on the issues that I introduced just now. And once we have the 10 minutes the allocation of 10 minutes slot, and then we will have a brief conversation amongst ourselves, and then we open up the dialogue to you for your questions and comments, which we're very much welcome. Okay, so without further ado, can I ask Leon to begin the process?
Riadh, do you want to go first? Because I can see you have notes.
I can save them for later.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Do you want me to go there and talk?
What do you prefer? So,
I'll stand.
okay, even I prefer standing. But use that microphone because of recording. Okay, thank you.
This microphone, yeah. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, David, and for the team who invited us. It's very exciting to be in a space with like-minded people and just to have a space for us to reflect and talk and work together. I think my philosophy of work is really about cultivating relationality and relationships, and I do believe knowledge is created through a set of relationships. So I hope today we will have a nice and fruitful and rewarding conversation and action plan moving forward. So I've been listening to our colleagues today regarding decolonization in general, what it means, what it looks like, and the different perspectives that David has presented. I've got a couple of notes, as Leon noticed, and I would like obviously to extend on some of the things that David was talking about during the presentation. But first of all, I'd like to ask us a question. The first one is really about what does the term mean and how useful is it? And I think that's the key questions that the event is trying to address. I'd like to start with a definition of decolonization. I think recently we have seen a rise of decolonial movements, decolonizing the curriculum project in different UK universities, and this is something, you know, to be commended and to support and to acknowledge, and it's a positive change that is happening. There is more dialogue, more awareness, but I still do feel we are still struggling with this concept. We are still struggling to define what is decolonization, and I think the reason why we are struggling is because we are used to having rigid definitions, rigid approaches and practices about teaching, learning, assessment, education, and so on. So we try to categorize everything and label everything, and that's why when we hear something controversial or different or diverse, we lose it. And I think that I would say that's fine. You know, that's fine if we have our own individual and personalized definition of decolonization. But before we try to define decolonization, we need to understand why do we need to decolonize? What's the importance? So what? Okay, the so what question is really important here. And I think it allows us to ask critical questions and reflexive questions as well. And I would like to take you, well, I would like us to reflect on this question. Why do we need to decolonize? So if we look back at history, there is a development of social hierarchies because of colonial legacies and colonial projects. And throughout history, we've seen this hierarchy being perpetuated within systems, power structures, or organizations, and so on. So we've seen, for example, Western knowledge is more valued, is more valid than quote-unquote non-Western knowledge. And I mean here indigenous knowledges and so on. We've seen, for example, racial, let's say European, can't pronounce this one, European people are more seen as valid and valued in every space rather than non-European people. So there is this social hierarchy that has been developed and built throughout the history. And that's why we are still enacting this social hierarchy. So what does decolonization do? Decolonization is really about challenging these social hierarchies. And it's not about cancel culture. It's not about canceling what already exist. It's really about undertaking and embracing a critical and reflexive approach to decenter the dominant forms of knowledge, dominant ways of knowing and being, and make space for other ways of knowing and being in the space which have been historically marginalized and underrepresented. So understanding why do we need to decolonize lead us to define what is decolonization. So I said early on, decolonization, can be personal. It's a personal project. So every one of you here might want to define decolonization according to their social identity. And it includes here race, it includes power, because we all have power, and we can use this power to change or influence. Privileges, we all have privileges. Oppressed identities, because we carry both. We carry both privileged and oppressed identities. Capital, lived experience, you name it. So all of these ingredients can help us to define our personal purpose, our personal vision, and our personal definition of decolonization. And obviously, because we work together within an organization, we might need to define decolonization collectively as well, so that the organization has a shared vision, a shared language. So here, decolonization can be defined personally and collectively as well. And in my experience doing decolonial work, I've seen so many colleagues and students doing brilliant work, but what I've noticed is that they see decolonization that happens on something, like it's about something, and they forget to decolonize themselves first. So I would say this is the very first point of departure. It's really about decolonizing the mind. And I'm sure many of you here, they say, oh, Riadh, what are you on about? What do you mean by decolonizing the mind? Again, it's a personal, ongoing process of learning, unlearning, examining our assumptions, biases, what we have internalized as well as truth, and really questioning all of that makes up our social identity, but also our positionality. And that informs our conversations with people, our work, relationships with colleagues, students, the curriculum, and so on. So it's really important to focus and really do the work on ourselves before doing the work on something else, which is the curriculum, the university. And they go hand in hand. It's not a tick box exercise like, oh, I've decolonized my mind today, and then tomorrow I'll do something else, which is the curriculum. So it's an ongoing process of self-reflection and reflexivity as a process. Leon has an article that speaks about decolonization and reflexivity, and I find it quite interesting. So, by the way, Leon didn't pay me to say this, so it's a genuine comment. I've read it. It's a great article. So it's really important to start with the mind, with the self, and work hand in hand with colleagues as well to see what this looks like in terms of our curriculum, teaching, and so on. And when we talk about decolonization, also it comes with different aspects. It's not one entity. It comes with different aspects that include the intersection of whiteness. So it's really important to interrogate whiteness. And what I mean here, whiteness as an ideology, as a colonial project, examining how whiteness has been embedded and embodied within our curriculum, our minds as well. And I can give you an example. Growing up, I'm from Algeria, by the way. So growing up, I've always thought, the West is the best. In order to be validated in a space, to be accepted, you have to have a Western thinking, Western identity. That wasn't mine. I identify myself as indigenous, Algerian, Kabyle, and that's my identity. But growing up, I parked this identity because I thought, Western ways of knowing and being are deemed more valid, more accepted whenever you go. So I tried to assimilate myself within this way of knowing and being. But again, here, it's not about cancelling this. It's really about claiming, the identity, the ways of knowing and being which have been suppressed and underrepresented. And it could be a healing process as well for so many communities that have been harmed by, colonization or systemic racism and so on. So I think what I would like to speak about right now, and I know I've got only 10, 15 minutes, is how useful is it? I would say decolonization is such an important project. It is significant. It is a significant concept, especially for people of color. Because I remember the first time when I came across the concept, I found myself reflected in this concept of decolonization. So I found the right language that speaks, for example, to the experience that I had, to the education that I had, and so on and so forth. So I could find comfort in this concept. And it empowered me in a way, empowered me, to talk to people, to use it as a catalyst of change, as part of my PhD, my scholarship, what I preach about in general. So it gave me the space, to feel liberated and liberate my mind. And that goes back to the process of decolonizing the mind. So how do we decolonize and how useful is it? I think it's a personal project, but also it's a collective project that requires planning, staff and students, and I think David was talking about it earlier, requires planning, working together, staff and students, hand in hand, implementing, reflecting, and sustaining. It's not a tick box exercise, it's not a one-off activity that we can do and just get on with our lives. It's really about this iterative process of planning, implementing, reflecting, and sustaining, and going back, because it's a process of going forward and backward, and learning from our mistakes, learning from our students and colleagues, and using that process of reflexivity to ask critical and important questions. It's not a linear process, it's not straightforward. It comes with, a lot of emotional labor because it creates discomfort, and I think it's really important as well to acknowledge the discomfort when we talk about decolonization. We're all uncomfortable when we talk about it, and that's fine. But discomfort, being uncomfortable, doesn't mean we are being unsafe. It means we are being challenged, perhaps. We are challenging the status quo. We are challenging what we've taken for granted as human beings in general, really, and reimagining things otherwise, reimagining things based on social justice principles. That's what decolonization is about. So again, planning, implementing, reflecting, sustaining, but this requires resources. This requires challenging power dynamics, looking at the structure, the makeup of the organization, who takes decisions, where does the funding go, who embodies power, who has access to power, and who doesn't. So all these questions need to be addressed in order to create, sustainable, meaningful, and purposeful changes, and also taking into consideration the workload, because obviously lecturers and students, and they have lots of things to do, the marking, the teaching, the prep, the assignments, the strikes, and so on. So where does this sit? Is it a priority, or is it just a one-off thing that we talk about and then we move on? So it's really important to be considering all these aspects. And I have a couple of questions perhaps for you to take away as audience, as colleagues, as brothers and sisters. The very first question is, perhaps you might want to define what is the ultimate purpose of decolonization. Okay, what is it? What are you trying to get out of this decolonial project? Who should be involved in this project? Who should be involved in, whose responsibility is to decolonize? And I think this is another important question to address. The other question, which is equally important, is how far should we decolonize? Are we only scratching the surface about diversifying the list, the reading list, for example? Is this decolonizing? Obviously, diversifying is important. But does it mean we are decolonizing? And diversifying doesn't lead to decolonization. Doesn't necessarily lead to decolonization. So again, how far should we decolonize? Because we can always go far with decolonization, but how far should we decolonize given the structures sometimes and the barriers and the challenges that we have and we encounter within our educational spaces? And who does it serve? Who does it serve? For whose benefit? I think these are important questions that we need to be reflecting on. We don't have to have the answer. again, I'm not here to convince you or to give you the answer. I don't know the answers to these questions, by the way. I have some thoughts, obviously, but perhaps these are some takeaways for you to consider. And I'll leave it there, and thank you so much again for listening.
That was excellent. Thanks so much. I'll leave it here.
Okay. I wanted to go after you so I can just like repeat what you said in a different way, like steal your ideas. Can I go?
Yes, please.
You will keep an eye on the time because
Yes, I am.
I have a reputation of speaking for 30
I will
minutes.
nudge you, don't worry.
Okay, yeah, please nudge. Okay, hi everybody. Very happy to be here. I would like to thank David in particular because we've been planning this event for a very long time, and it was actually arranged to happen, I don't know when it was, maybe 6 months ago, and there was lots of train strikes which made it very difficult to go ahead with the event. So thanks to David's persistence and his passion and dedication, that's why we're all here today, and that's why we're having this event. And Westminster University are very lucky to have somebody who's so committed as David. So please give David a round of applause for this effort. Good job. Okay, look, we don't have much time, so, personally, I think these events should be 3 minimum hours, 3 minimum. We need maybe 6 hours, maybe even 12 hours, and I'm willing to sit here for 12 hours and talk about this. So let's get to the point. I want to just explain how I understand decolonization by drawing our attention to the picture on the wall. I'm so sorry if people at home cannot see. I don't know if the camera can move or not. We've got all this high-tech equipment. Sometimes it's so high-tech, it can't even move. Maybe that's also a good metaphor for the university. But anyway, there's a picture on the wall which caught my attention. And this picture up here, as you can see, looks like, to me, some type of serious discussion. But what we might say about this serious discussion when there is all of these, materials on the wall and they're thinking something and figuring something out, trying to make a decision and trying to scrutinize something, what we might say is, who cares? So what? It's just a picture. I've not even noticed it. I didn't even look up. Why does it even matter? That might be one perspective, but another perspective might ask, who is in the picture and who gets to join in with such discussions? The dog gets to join in the discussion. The dog can sniff around the discussion. But how come there's no women, for example? Or how come there's no people of color as the term that we used? Now, I'm not saying there must be women and there must be people of color in every piece of artwork, because obviously this isn't realistic. In certain eras, this was an accurate representation. But what I'm trying to highlight by, focusing on this image is just the sort of perspective that those people who talk about decolonization come from. It's from a perspective that says who gets to talk, who gets to be heard, who gets to feel like they belong, and who gets to feel like they don't belong. Now, this might seem irrelevant to some of you, and if it seems irrelevant, probably it's because you are feeling like you belong, and you are feeling like you can be heard and you can have a voice. Those people who aren't traditionally welcome in such discussions are very familiar with the feeling of knowing that this space is somewhere where if you're allowed to enter, maybe your ancestors were probably not allowed to enter. So the crux of decolonization for me, and I want to make it more interesting, if you don't mind, by being provocative and by sort of trying to disagree, like not for the sake of being an idiot and trying to break friends with these wonderful people, but just for the sake of generating ideas and discussion. So, for example, I want to go back to the slide, one of the slides that you put where there was the four elements of decolonization. I think one was about, the position of the author, one was about the students and the pedagogy or something like that. Was it 3 or 4? Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, what I wanted to say is that in my interpretation of decolonization, this is a good starting point, but it can actually be about a lot more than that. And I'm going to give you a few examples, what I jotted down, of what else decolonization might be, in addition to thinking about it in terms of curriculum, or in terms of pedagogy, or in terms of how we as authors express ourselves. So the first thing that I want to mention is space and place, which is something kind of what we're talking about now. Because those people who raise questions about decolonizing universities, they don't only talk about how we teach and what we teach and what we research and how we research, but they also talk about the actual physical setting of the university and the way in which this space is configured, which might be more and less conducive to certain types of expression or certain types of communication or certain types of cultural backgrounds or linguistic backgrounds. So this is another element, like a big part of this decolonization thing was about statues, wasn't it? It was about the name of buildings and in my university, University of Liverpool, they renamed, one, I think it was the student halls, like the student residence. Like, so there's this renaming thing, which is about space. So what is going on with space and place and buildings and the history of those buildings? We were saying before the event when we were chatting, and they were telling me, what do you think of London? Because I don't live here, I live in near Manchester. And, this is a very new, exciting, place for me as a northerner to come to the big city and to see the bright lights. And one of the things I said to them is that the buildings here, they strike me as very grand and impressive, but we also made the connection that this is a mirror image of what we might see in other colonies or ex-colonies where there is the underdevelopment, so this is what these decolonial scholars talk about, the overdevelopment and the underdevelopment. So we see the grand hall that we're in today is not just a grand hall that is to be admired, but it's a grand hall that is to be connected to the lack of a grand hall in some other spaces, in some other communities, in some other countries, societies, or places. So that's another element. The other thing of decolonization, I'm sorry if I speak fast, it's because of the time issue. The other thing of decolonization for me is again, not only about curriculum and pedagogy and all this is important, but it's more than that because it's also about relationships between people, relationships between colleagues, but also relationships with students and different types of students. Because those people who come from this decolonial perspective would say that in the university, the relationships that exist are shaped by the historical conditions of colonial relations. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'll try and articulate it in a different way. In other words, the way that I look at you and the way you look at me, or the way I treat you and the way that you treat me, is not just based on whether you like me and I like you and if we get on and we don't get on. There's a whole history and a historical baggage that's informing how do we look at people who are racialized, who are stereotyped, pigeonholed, as black, as white, as Arab, as Pakistani, as, whatever you are, as Muslim, as Jewish, as, as queer, as whatever you are, right? So this idea of relationships in the decolonial kind of perspective, as I understand it, is about recognizing that history comes into the relationships. And I firmly believe this is the case, because I believe that the way in which, I've written a couple of articles about this, by the way, the way in which certain students, for example, are perceived and treated. In the case of my articles, I talked about East Asian students, which usually means Chinese students. The way in which Chinese students, as one example, are perceived, are stereotyped, and are treated is a reflection of what we call Orientalism. There's an Orientalist thing that exists in the mind of academics where we look at East Asian students and we stereotype them in a particular way and we think they're going to be like something, or they're desirable in a certain way but they're undesirable in another way. And this is about historical legacy of colonialism. Another thing is about access to universities and the relationship with the community. Now, as you just came in here, and this is not a criticism of this wonderful institution of Westminster University where Pink Floyd was founded, I read outside. There's a plaque. I don't even know what songs Pink Floyd have produced, but I've heard of them. Maybe someone who's good in karaoke can give us some songs, because it's not my kind of music. But anyway, Pink Floyd were founded here, wonderful, but I don't know what they would have to say about the fact that now, in order to get into this building, you need to tap. You need to tap, and this is common in universities, not this university. Many universities you need to tap, right? And many universities, the person who approaches the gate, even if you're an academic and even if you're a student, if you don't look in a certain way and if you don't fit a certain demographic, it's like, yes, can I help you? I'm here to give, I'm not saying this happened today, by the way, it didn't, but can I help you? Yeah, I'm here to give a talk, or yes, I'm a member of staff, or yes, I'm a PhD student here in astrophysics, or, whatever. Oh, really? Oh, have you got ID with you? Oh, okay, so these are, you might use this word microaggression. I don't know if you like this word or not. I don't know, it's a bit of an awkward term, but the point is that when it comes to accessing universities, and I like this explanation, I think it's quite interesting, have been described as gated communities. Universities are gated communities. Universities are not open and accessible to everybody, and this is something that those people who are calling for decolonization are saying. We need to rethink what is the role of this institution which sits within a city. I mean, London's a bit weird because London is like I don't know if you can say there's a community here, like everyone seems to just be like business kind of thing. Maybe I'm misunderstanding London. But anyway, most of the universities I go to, they're usually in a town or in a place where there are residents and people live nearby to the university. I'm not sure about how it works here exactly. But the question is, how is that university part of the community or not part of the community? How does it give to the community or doesn't give? How does it take from the community? They told me, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I was told that the University of Liverpool is built upon the dispossessed homes of poor communities and racialized communities, like racial minority communities. So if that's true, that's quite interesting, isn't it? The next thing I want to mention, which is related to that, is about economic access, because another aspect of decolonization, and there's many different dynamics, I'm just trying to give a few to elaborate on the definition that was provided. The other idea, when these students, especially in South Africa, were saying roads must fall, they were accompanying that by fees must fall. So there was always an element of economic inequality and economic injustice, like the university perpetuating economic injustice, which tends to affect those people who were the descendants of the losers of colonialism. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But it still happens today because, well, number one, why do our international students need to pay double the fees? That's one question. Number two, how come our international students come from countries whose economies are generally, not always of course, but generally much weaker than like UK or Western European? How come the British pound? Like I know students who, I'm not like lying when I say this, you might find this weird, who sold their house and their father's house to come and study in the UK. And I'm like, why did you do that? That was like, is it worth it? Because anyway, that's a different question. But people make such sacrifices because of how expensive it is. I was saying this to someone yesterday. It's as if, like, imagine us British citizens, whoever's British here, or those who live in the UK and have a UK salary. If someone said to us, you can get a degree, but it'll cost you £1 million, you'll be like, no thanks. But people around the world are doing that and making that sacrifice because in a way, maybe they feel they have no choice or maybe they feel that's the way for them to get opportunities. So this is the type of sacrifice that people are making that we, those of us who are kind of from more privileged spaces, we don't have to encounter. And that's why the economic dimension of universities as these spaces, these corporations which take so much profit and so much resources, especially from students who are, as I said, from other countries, this is highly questionable. Okay. The next thing I want to say was building on something that you said at the beginning about virtue signaling, and I think if I heard you rightly, I'm trying to be provocative and make it maybe more interesting. So, because sometimes these discussions are a bit stagnant, we say the same things again. So I want to try and generate ideas, and I might be wrong, by the way. Please disagree with me. I'm just throwing my ideas. I think what you said, which is correct, is that sometimes decolonization is a type of virtue signaling, and it's something that is done for the sake of, like, look at us, look at how good we are, tick box exercise, and that's absolutely true. But what I think is we can add to that, because I think you said this is something that might be done by those who are privileged, like from the privileged majority, whoever that is. But what I also argue in my own work is that it's not only those who are privileged, and I think maybe we're like using that as a synonym for white people. Yeah, it's not only white people who might do this kind of virtue signaling, but it can also be scholars academics who are from, do we use this term BAME? Do you use BAME? I don't know. BAME or whatever you call it these days. So BAME scholars can also find themselves engaging in this type of tokenistic decolonization. And the reason this is important to me is because sometimes there's this impression that sometimes we don't recognize that BAME scholars might also be the beneficiaries of colonialism. BAME scholars, I'm sorry if you don't like this term BAME, I just use it as a shorthand, but we recognize it's problematic. So BAME scholars might also be privileged and from that privileged majority, in the sense that there might be people in certain countries, cultures outside of the university who look at scholars who are in the university and say, what are you talking about? You and them, it's the same thing. You're all in there having your fancy discussions with your fancy samosas, doing whatever you're doing there, filming with all this high-tech equipment, admiring artwork, and we're out here struggling. So don't tell me that you're decolonizing and they're not decolonizing. So I'm just trying to make it something more, and maybe you've got something to say about that, I don't know, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. Do I need to stop, or shall I carry on? Okay.
I've got another 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, you're very generous. Okay, next thing I want to say, when it comes to decolonization, somehow there's this big problem of echo chambers, and it relates to what Riadh was saying about cancel culture. Somehow, we get together like this, and we're like, oh yeah, let's decolonize, it's really good, it's really nice, and we need to do it, and all this kind of stuff. But actually, what we forget, and this is very important, and it relates to what you said as well about the polls, we forget that there's a lot of people who are not persuaded, and who are not only not persuaded, but who are opposed to it. So you can make yourself feel good and say, yeah, we're decolonizing, we're all on the same page, and we're getting there, and things are getting better. But actually, I think the majority, and I think the polls, these polls are very problematic because they're very misleading, but they do give us a taste of the fact that when this coronation happens this weekend, for example, most people, I think most people are kind of proud, and they enjoy it, and they like it. And that's not just white people or British people, that's also people from other communities as well, right? People really love this kind of stuff. And that is also true, I think, this is my suggestion, and I might be wrong, so feel free to disagree if you think otherwise, but I think that also applies to academics in the university, but they might not come to this event. Yeah, they might not speak up, and they might be fearful of this cancel culture kind of thing. So I think we need to be mindful that if you feel optimistic that the university can be decolonized or is being decolonized, maybe you need to think again about whether there are as many allies, and I mean committed, serious kind of allies to this kind of struggle as what we initially thought about. Like I said, sometimes these discussions get stagnant, and so one of the things that I'm interested in as well, I'm not only interested in talking about like what is decolonization and how do we do it, I'm also interested in talking about what are the limitations of trying to decolonize and what are the dangers. Like, for example, this idea that we might engage in tokenistic decolonization, or the idea that we might not only do nothing, but we might even reinscribe or reinforce colonialism or coloniality, whatever you want to call it. So this is another dimension to my interest. Maybe we're going to come to that later if we have time. And I guess I'll try not to take too much time, but I think the final thing I just want to say, just to try and reiterate, going back full circle about like what is decolonization. The other thing I want to say about this whole thing of like how universities experienced differently by different people, this is very important, because I think as would be natural, we usually only understand the world through our own experience, right? I don't know, this is getting like phenomenological now, so I don't know, I might be wrong on this, but I think we generally think the world is experienced how we experience the world, right? So if we feel the world is safe, we presume that most people feel the world is safe, or unsafe, we feel like most people feel like that. But I think what we don't often get to achieve, and unless you do like social research, which is one of the beautiful things about doing research, where you get to ask people, how do you feel about this, and why do you feel like that? So generally, we as academics or students, whatever you are, activists, whoever you are, we might not appreciate and we might not realize how different the experience of the university is for different people. Because we might come to the university and we might feel this is the place where we thrive, and this is the place where we grow, this is the place where we read books, we have an office, we get paid, we get to talk, we get people to listen to us, and we get to make friends, and we like to come in, we can cycle in and we can enjoy the fresh air on the way. But the point I'm making is that not everybody experiences the university like this, and this is why this whole decolonial movement is about trying to turn the gaze from, because we academics are always looking outside. It's like, let's look at ourselves, let's turn the gaze back to ourselves, and let's ask, what is this institution that we all belong to? Because most academics, perhaps, feel as though like we're kind of proud, we're all desperate to get here, we're all fighting to get a position at the table, the academic table, and then when we get there, maybe we're like, yes, we've made it kind of thing, but maybe we forget in the process that there are many people who are still fighting to get at a table, and who get to the table but who are struggling with being there because of it sounds like a strong word, but it's true, and it's how people talk about it, because of the trauma that university generates for certain people, which if you can't relate to that, shows maybe that you're fortunate to be from a kind of privileged kind of place. But I was speaking to people today, who don't want to stay in academia because it's tough, and it's a place of selfishness, and it's a place of exploitation and manipulation. And so decolonization to me is asking the question, how do we re-look and re-examine universities as an institution in terms of what it does for staff and students who are already here, but also what its potential can be for the wider community. And I'm sorry to speak for so long.
Thank you, Leon. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leon and Riadh and everyone. I think I am by far and away the least qualified person on this panel to speak about this, but in some ways maybe that is what I can bring to this panel, because I'm someone that has had the choice and really has had the privilege of saying, I don't really care about this, but nevertheless I'm here and I do care about it. So I thought that it would be useful to sort of break it into three different things. So one is the personal perspective, which Riadh, you picked up on, and which I think is really important. The second is the small way in which my own academic research relates to what we're talking about. And the final thing is kind of how I think that applies to the pedagogy from my perspective. So I think the first thing is that Dibyesh, you said, let me just see what you said. You said something about, conversations are not enough. And actually, of course, conversations are not enough. But what's really important and interesting to me is that conversations are what started my journey. And it is through conversation, it is through continued conversations with people that I am finally, I think, getting to a place where I'm even beginning to understand what any of this means. Because honestly, however keen I've been, I've really, really not got it. And I probably still haven't, but I feel like I'm getting closer, and I'm only getting closer by having a lot of conversations with people. And actually, for me, the absolute key turning points have been people's lived experience. It has been listening to, tuning into, understanding, really trying to reflect on the lived experiences of people who don't have the privileges that I've had. And I've had to learn what that means. I've had to learn what white privilege is. I've had to understand the concept of privilege. I'm still trying to learn about that. And I think for me, in terms of trying to understand what decolonialization means, it has been really to just start to get to grips with what colony is about and what colonialization is about, and to try and understand what that even means before I can, and to go beyond it just being, to recognize that it's about power structures and hierarchy and all sorts of other things that really have gone over my head for most of my life. And then actually being able to recognize how those colonial structures exist in my world and how they play out in my world and in other people's worlds. And to recognize the concept of discomfort that you talked about, and then to really be driven to actively seek things out. And that, I guess, is the personal journey that I'm on. And it's not something, I agree, that can be done overnight. And for me, as someone who has been committed, it's still taken a long time to even get to where I am. I think the challenges that you spoke about are really interesting. You spoke about maybe we don't have as many allies as we think. And that has been, like, there have been so many moments where I have just been bowled over by things that I've learned about. And this, again, is a complete reflection of my privilege. But I just kind of assumed everyone would be on board with this. I really genuinely thought everyone would think this was a great idea. And it's kind of shocking to me, not to many others I recognize, but to me it's shocking at how resistant people are. And that's in the university, that's in my personal life, people that I think I know really well, and I find this resistance, and to even talking about stuff. And I think, I'm a trustee for Age UK, and in one of the trustee meetings, I brought in the idea that we should be looking at decolonizing the space and the structures at Age UK. And literally people laughed in my face. They just laughed and said, I don't think we need to do that. There's no colonialization anymore. And I think, again, one of the challenges for me is knowing how to respond in those situations, and it's something I'm really learning. The other day, I was in Portsmouth and having a conversation with a stranger, but he said something about, we have to put these big gates up now because, there's too many foreigners around. I mean, sentences that I just kind of, they throw me so far away because and that for me at the moment, my challenge is learning how and when to respond to people. And what to say, and to reflect with the benefit of hindsight, so that the next time it happens, I can have a better and quicker response to people. So that's a bit about the kind of personal side of things. I think from an academic perspective, so my area of research is memory, as David said at the beginning. And there's a number of areas in which that's really important. So I think, Leon, a lot of what you said about we are our past, and we see the world through the eyes of someone who has a particular experience. So I think there's a number of areas in which my research becomes relevant. So I've worked a lot with people with amnesia. So someone with amnesia, people that I've worked with, sometimes absolutely no memory of their past whatsoever. They can maybe know that a few things happened to them when they were younger, but they have no sense of reliving anything beyond maybe an hour or two ago. And for those people, they are really stranded. They feel stranded. They can't. Their identity is affected. They don't really have that kind of concrete sense of identity that most of us have. Their social relationships are affected, and their ability to make plans and to judge things and to imagine a future, all of those things are completely disrupted by not having a memory. And that concept of personal amnesia is only not even a metaphor. It's the reality of what happens when you erase or try to remove or try to hide someone's cultural past, their collective past, and try to pretend it isn't there. And there are so many examples in the memory literature of what happens and how it utterly disrupts someone's health and well-being and identity and ability to function and all of those things if you try to distort or remove or cancel or lie about their history. So our histories and our memories are utterly crucial to who we are. But that's the kind of conscious stuff. That's the stuff that we know about. But what also is hugely relevant here is the memories that you carry with you without even knowing why you carry these memories and why you behave in a particular way. But everything that ever happens to us imprints on the way we interact with the world. And that goes back as well. You know, that also is goes through generations. And so I think the more I'm starting to kind of put my own research onto this topic, I'm recognizing the huge importance of acknowledging someone's history, a person's history and a culture's history and so on. There is another way in which I think my research is relevant, and that is that one of the things that I do is I ask people about their stories. So my research is understanding how the memory system works, and because of that, I have all sorts of ways that I ask people about their life. And it might be as simple as asking people for their 8 favourite songs. And believe me, asking someone for their 8 favourite songs is the most amazing way to get at someone's history. And it's a lovely way to do it as well. But what I've learned from that is that I can really learn a lot about a person by asking those basic questions. And as soon as I learn about that person, the way that I interact with them, and actually, Leon, as you were saying, being able to see it through somebody else's eyes, that happens very quickly. So I've had an enormous, the enormous privilege of having learned about an awful lot of people's lived experiences. And every time I do that, it makes me aware, and in fact, this is research that I'm going on to do now, is to look at using those kind of ways of trying to get people to break some of these barriers down. A number of people have talked about these divides and the barriers, and how can we get a better understanding between people? How can we enable and facilitate that understanding? And so I think that's another way in which my research might be relevant. So finally, I just wanted to think, how does this apply? How does this apply to what I do? Now, when I first knew about this concept, so I guessed that I had started to understand racism properly, maybe, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago, maybe 10. But been a very, very slow journey to really understand how that relates to the pedagogical work that I do. And I started with really basic stuff. You know, I started with the pictures in the book I'd written and the pictures that I used, which, you know, on one level is incredibly superficial and can be very tokenistic, but actually it was a really good reflective exercise to stop and think, who's represented in the pictures here? I wrote my book, they sent it back with all these illustrations. Every single one was a white person. I said, that's not what I want. I don't want it to only speak to you know, some people. So I started with really basic things like that and looking at things like book lists, trying to learn a bit about the scholars that I was talking about. I mean, that's a huge job, but also incredibly important. But I think one of the really big things for me has been about trying to decolonize the space. It's about trying to recognize whether somebody does feel that they belong. And Leon, your words were so important to me there, and they are the things that I am continually having to actively reflect on, because like you say, some of us are it's very, you know, there's many situations where I just do feel like I belong, because you know, that's everything is set up to kind of fit with my background and my world, and so I have to be really, really proactive in trying to seek out whether somebody feels like they don't belong. But I think the more that I learn and the more that I study and the more that I listen, the more I start to intuitively recognize when that might be happening. And so some of the work we've been doing in psychology is just to go back to that really basic stuff and have the conversations and try and enable people to develop better understanding of what it is like to be anyone other than yourself, really, in different environments. So, yeah, and I guess the final thing is that I am really trying to reflect on is this concept of access to power, and really fundamentally to finish with what I started with who gets to choose. Who gets to choose and why do they get to choose? Because, you know, we look at the number of people who are in this room, and there are a lot of people who get to choose not to engage. And I think it's really interesting to think about why that is and what we can do about that. And I'm going to stop there.
I'm the last one, and I'll time myself, so don't worry about it. So exact 10 minutes, not 10 to 15, because it's always confusing. If you give academics time 10 or 15, then we'll take 15. So, and that's the idea, right? But I also want some discussion here. So again, let me say, and it's good what Leon was saying, that we do need conversation. Conversation doesn't mean we need to agree. We would have focus on different ideas. The reason I also prefer to go last is because I put some points there which I can't read my own handwriting, and it's true. Right? But also because I did not want to cover what other people are covering. So I'll start with the idea that I'm not a big fan of using the word decolonized. So in my own work, in general, I do not use the word decolonizing. I use the word decolonizing. I don't use the word decolonized or decolonization, because for me, decolonizing is a process. So it's not something that's an end goal that we achieve, and this is now a decolonized institution or decolonized practice or decolonized idea. It's a process of decolonizing. I use that. Now, just listening to everyone and thinking about it, I was feeling quite old. And I was feeling old, by the way, right? Now, of course, I know you talk teenagers, they feel old. I'm not a teenager, but I was feeling old. The reason for that is I'll go back to a particular conference we had earlier this year in Montreal. I was part of a panel that was 20 years on from a publication of a book. That was one of the first books on post-colonial international relations, which is my area. And I was one of the authors in that. So I thought, oh, I do feel old, like 20 years later of, the work I did. But we were reflecting on where are we in the discipline of politics and international relations 20 years later. We have more people doing decolonizing, but I did not feel that we have moved far away from where we were. And I'll give you an example. So I was part of that conversation on decolonizing, post-colonial, etc., looking at race, ethnicity, gender, class, all of that. Mine was the only paper that talked about colonization by non-Western states. So all the other papers were talking of West as the colonizing power, and then brown and black people being the victims of colonization or in some way related, or global South being a victim. Now, my work is on Tibet and China. If you pay any attention to Tibet and China or Uyghurs in China, you know it is China that's a colonizing power. So this whole idea of coloniality somehow being exclusively or primarily or mainly a phenomenon of the West or whiteness does not work. Now, you may argue that China is Western. Chinese are practicing whiteness. Say that to Chinese government. Fine. Or Turkish government is practicing whiteness with the Kurds or Alawis. I know some colleagues work on it. Or Indian government practices whatever, that Indian government is somehow continuing the colonial practices of British Empire vis-a-vis Kashmiris. They do. But the problem with this continuity argument that somehow the non-Western states are continuing the old practices of colonial power is it takes away the agency of the contemporary nation states that are colonizing from them. So it's still back to why is India colonizing Kashmir? Why is India suppressing Kashmir or Pakistan suppressing Baloch, etc.? Oh, that's because they're behaving like British did in the past. Okay. Is that enough? Is that the end of the argument? Or do we start by saying, okay, so India and Pakistan are colonial powers like Britain was, but 60, 70, 80 years on, do we still go back to where it came from or rather focus on who is actually practicing coloniality? So what I found in much of the discussion on post-colonial and decolonial, that there was so much focus on the West and non-West and the whiteness and the rest that a lot of global South is erased. So what is not decoloniality and decolonizing for me is, of course, Rishi Sunak being Prime Minister. Is that, Rishi Sunak, Suella Braverman, Preeti Patel? I hope no one sees that as an example of coloniality. That's not decolonizing at all. But is decoloniality also, let's say, who was the most radical person? Jeremy Corbyn and his politics, which, whether we like it or not, there was an active ignoring of certain forms of racism. I'm talking of anti-Semitism. There's a lot of work done on that. Or what does it tell us about a left-wing party? I know Labour Party is not left-wing, by the way, but parts of Labour is left-wing. And it's relatively center-left. How come the Conservatives found a recipe where they could find more, for token purpose, but it's more than token, more brown and black people than Labour Party could? So what is going wrong with Labour? So I'm not saying Conservative getting it right. It's completely abhorrent what they do. Tory party should just disappear from the face of the earth. That's better. But we cannot just ignore the fact that the left on its own has a certain, pardon my ableist language, blindness when it comes to ethnicity, racial identity, because for them it's largely about class. And there's a whole debate on the left circle about why they're anxious about the, anything not related to class politics. So that's something to bear in mind. But what decolonization is also not is, I'll give you an example. Walter Mignolo, one of the big figures on decoloniality, decolonial theory, he wrote a blurb of a book written by an Indian person who talked of decolonizing India. Right? Nice book written by someone in India talking of we need to decolonize India. How do we decolonize India? We need to throw out all the colonial vestiges of knowledge, the British, white, whatever, great. And also we need to throw out all the knowledge produced by Muslims who ruled India from 12th century AD. So the book is essentially saying we need to decolonize India by removing all the traces of Europeans and Muslims, all of them somehow foreign, from 12th century till 20th century, and the blurb is written by Mignolo, who later withdrew it, by the way. Apparently, he had not read the book and did the blurb. He apologized. Now, but he's not the only one. Why would, and the author is a far-right Hindu nationalist. And Hindu nationalists in India, who are far-right, by the way, the fascists, they use the language of decolonial, they use the word decolonial, because for them, the whole project is to make India away from Western and Christian and Muslim and every other thought. And the problem we have with the whole thinking on decolonization that takes place in institutions like in the UK is in the process we are so, and again, we are talking ourselves also, we sometimes are so obsessed with the West and non-West that we ignore the asymmetry of power in the non-Western context, global South context. So someone like myself from India, upper middle class, upper caste, privileged caste, right? In everything, yes, I'm queer, etc., right? And here I'm ethnic minority, but I do come from all kinds of privileges. I'll become the voice of decolonial thought and decolonizing practices. or Edward Said would, right? And we know the class privilege there. I'm not saying that we should not be talking of it, but we have to be aware broadly of the context where we all come from. And you were talking about how we have to be careful that it's not all non-white or BME or whatever voices that are equally there. But you have got a phenomenon here in UK and US context, I've noticed. Quite a few radical Indians in UK context, but maintain silence on Hindu nationalism in India, and they maintain complete silence on the longest and most pernicious form of racism that exists in the world. And that is not anti-black racism. That is casteism. The majority of Indians of different kinds, and they were Hindus, but they were Muslims and Christians also practice, despite all the language of egalitarianism. The casteism that they practice is where the majority are always treated very hierarchically. And there's complete silence here. There are very few of us who even mention caste phenomenon. You'd see class, you'll talk of race, ethnicity. Where is the caste here? Where majority of us will not. Now, the reason I highlight all of this is because decolonizing, for me, is not therefore it's simply about diversifying, but it is important to diversify. I said, therefore, I gave you example of Corbyn or Labour Party where we should not keep silent just because they're better than Tories, because they do have a serious problem with certain things. It is not simply about shifting the focus away from the West to elsewhere. No, we need to have a conversation here, but we need to have conversation elsewhere also. It's not only about the problems here and problems there. We need to talk of that. It's essentially about recognizing how does coloniality shape our thinking. So the reason I'm interested in this whole project, and so, okay, 20 years ago I was part of that book. I've been teaching post-colonial politics in IR for the last 12 years here, practically, changing the title here and there. And that is a core module for politics in IR, and it's one of the rare universities. Since 2020, a lot of universities talk of anti-racism. And you know what happened in 2020, including a murder of a particular person. The trend is going, and we have to be very watchful and mindful of how the trend is shifting in different places. In our context, yes, I'll come back to the paintings also. In our context, this was a core module, post-colonial politics and IR. And there was some resistance by some people, but that's fine. There was resistance. You'd argue, and you'd compromise in some places, and you move on. So we've been doing that. I'm not saying we have got it right, by the way. I'm not saying we are better than others. I'm just saying, but that's the conversation. Now, for me, therefore, decolonizing is about first and foremost recognizing what is coloniality. Coloniality is essentially about asymmetry of power. It is about use of knowledge for purposes of power. It is about recognizing hierarchies between people. It is about violence. It is about various things. But ultimately, it's also about paternalism, that I know what's good for you and you don't. I'm not looking at you, but I know what's good for you. And, therefore, saying that even if you don't like it, I'll change it for you. That's the whole coloniality part. For me, decolonizing, therefore, is about recognizing and not forgetting what coloniality has been about. So it's about recognizing that, seeing to what extent and what forms, and it's a very, to what forms of coloniality takes place in contemporary world. I'm a student of history, so I like history, but I do want to focus on contemporary times also. What forms of coloniality take place in everyday interaction? How do we decolonize mind, kind of thing? It's very important. That's the most important thing. We know it. It's about decolonizing institutions. Universities is one of them, but universities are not the only one. Otherwise, it leads to a situation where we are seen as a woke universities, and the wider society is somehow different, but we have to challenge that. But also decolonizing practices, everyday life. And it's not about having a toolkit that we can then have a perfect answer. It's about the everyday convey where we learn from each other. We disagree with each other, and we also challenge each other. But what matters most, and I'll conclude in 1.5 minutes now, is context. Context matters. So what can be oppressive here, or what identity might be oppressed here can be oppressive elsewhere. I gave you the example of caste, ethnicity, whatever, right? Chinese, when you talk Chinese identity. What if, and I have heard that where you challenge China on Uyghurs and Tibetans, and you will get Chinese scholars and students saying that, oh, that's hurting our sentiments. That's xenophobic. You criticize Israel on its conduct in Palestine, oh, that's something else. You criticize India on its Islamophobia or Kashmir, oh, that's Hindu-phobic, right? So this whole debate we have to be aware of, and context matters most crucial, because when we are dealing with institutions like ours, and I'm sure Liverpool are, but I'm sure you have different institutions, but we are one of the most diverse in the world. That's let's say in which case we are slightly different from yours possibly. In our case, diversity is not only of the privileged minority of the Oxbridge kind, where you get Saudi prince or the Chinese leader's son or daughter coming and studying. We have a diversity of very different kind, where majority of people come from very challenging backgrounds of all kinds. So the struggle for us is, and you mentioned SOAS a couple of times, David, right? And I do say to even SOAS colleagues that our radicalism and our endeavors is not of a privileged radical kind of SOAS. What do I mean by it? Our students in general are not sons and daughters of privileged class wherever in UK or beyond, who come here, then who explore and discover radicalism for 2-3 years, and then 5 or 10 years later they disappear. Their radicalism also disappears. Our radicalism is of a different kind, and this is a challenge which we face. I don't know what the answer is, that for us, yes, decolonizing is very important, diversity is important, but also important is to recognize that for many of our students, and most of them from marginalized ethnic and other backgrounds, surviving is the struggle. It is flourishing in the society, and their aspirations might be to flourish rather than deal with decolonizing and diversifying all the time. So how do we balance that is a crucial part, right? But it's going to be contested. So I'll end by saying that for me, decolonizing is something that's an ongoing process because it's about contestation. It's about discovering, they were discussing, it's about recognizing the context, it's about recognizing our differences, but not seeing that I'm more radical than thou, the holier than thou. And I do find, so what I find, and I'll admit that in academic world, in academia, including on Twitter academia or academic Twitter, there's so much of virtue signaling going back to it, but so much of, oh, I'm so more radical than you, you're so more radical, so if you compromise one, you're gone. We have seen how that does not function, that does not help anyone, and therefore for me, a way out to you asking is that we continue conversation, we take actions, we may get it wrong, we say sorry, and we carry on. But we do not, I started by saying I feel old, but I also feel very young. The reason I feel young is, okay, I know I'm being ageist here, but I feel young in the sense that I feel energized every time I have this kind of conversation. I feel very energized when we interact with our students from different backgrounds, and they said, you know what? What you said that point in time makes so much sense to me. I don't need to ask what sense I made, but so much sense to me, thank you. So when we have that interaction, for me, that's what we should be aiming for. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I'd like to wholeheartedly thank every one of the members of the panel. We had a fantastic discussion here, really amazing points raised here. I'd like to open up the discussion to the audience here. Anyone have a question or comment? By all means.
So my point is about why people have certain views about society and culture and racism and so on. And one of the key things for me has been this concept of implicit bias. Now, I've not heard anyone mention this concept. It's how we form our ideas about others and ourselves. And it's unintentional, it's fast thinking, as defined by Daniel Kahneman. And it's things that you can't change in adults once they've got hold of their biases. And so this is why, as Catherine said, when you come into a group of people who have very defined ideas and you point a new idea, they can't understand it because their thinking is based on implicit bias. So what are the panel's points, or if they have any, on implicit bias?
Thank you. I'm just curious to understand what has been the impact of the decolonization process in curriculum, and what kind of changes have you all observed over the period of time?
Thank you, everyone. And I want to thank the university for this opportunity. For me, when one of the speakers was talking about decolonizing the mind, I first of all heard that from Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the African writer. And I know that even as an individual, if you decide to decolonize your mind, like those you want to propagate equality and social justice in the system, the system or the environment tends to make it difficult. I'll give you an instance. Like, as a student, if I'm filling a form, somebody will ask me, or the questionnaire will say, are you black, or black British, or African? You know, these are elements of colonialism. Because you that is asking that question, there's a reason why you are asking that question. And again, a certain university, I noticed, their entrepreneurship department was organizing, it's like empowerment for students. And they said, certain students, I don't want to mention the university, certain students can participate in this and this, but if you know you're an international student, you can't do this because you cannot take the prize back to your country to invest. And I find that very, very absurd. For me, it's my personal opinion. So I'm bringing the money from the foreign country to this place, and I win a prize, and I cannot take that same money to invest back in my country. I did not participate in that competition. So I think that even opportunities, in the way the system is structured, deprives some people of opportunities. So, like, you want to be a research assistant, someone will say, because you're an African, whatever education you got there does not really matter. As long as it's not in this system, you got the education, it has no value. And again, this is also absurdity. Does it mean Africans don't have creative minds? I beg to ask. Does it mean that civilization did not start from Egypt years ago with the pyramids and all that? Does it mean that nothing good comes out of Africa? So for me, I think the structure, the environment needs to be reorganized. Because if it is not done that way, individuals will come in and always have, oh, this is how the system operates. Some will not say it sincerely. They'll just say, let me get what I want and leave. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yeah, I'm cool.
What was your question?
So my question is, it is not about the individual. The problem is with the environment. So the environment that is sincere should work towards decolonizing itself before talking about individual decolonization.
Okay, I'll try and keep this very quick. Thank you to the panel for really invigorating talks. It was wonderful for me to listen to different perspectives. I just wonder whether the panel could comment on decolonisation as it relates to the UK as a collective. So I've met the children of parents and grandparents who were involved in British India, for example, or Africa, or colonialism in some way. And these young people, and it's not just one person, I've met many, are really struggling with their identities of being white and living in the world that we live in and not sensing a place for themselves. And so that really opened my eyes to the fact that this is a collective project, and we also need to open ourselves to looking at what we may think is the other side of the post-colonial landed colonial generation or the middle classes. And in that way, the story belongs to all of us, and we have different demons to struggle against. So thank you.
Yes, last question.
I just want to go back to the question, does it deliver or disappoint? And I wonder if the speakers could make a comment on this. I'm a student at the University of Brighton and I'm doing my PhD. And I am using the colonial method for my research. And I find it quite difficult to proceed with my research because even though the university talk about decolonizing methodology and and even decolonizing curriculum, but when it comes to research, it becomes like there is a massive barrier, particularly with the ethics board. They don't seem to, even though they talk about you coming up with a new innovative way of research, but they don't seem to understand decolonizing methodology. Can I speak a little bit further? Or yeah, okay. To just give an example, in terms of exchanging knowledge in where I come from, Nigeria, my culture, Yoruba people, when you exchange knowledge, you give a gift. So when I put that in my research that I'll be giving a gift, that was a bit problematic for them. And also, when I make a farm comment where I said, if development practice and study could open up ideas into Africa's central understanding of the self-obligation of society, for instance, that social policy and political development will look radically different. They said that I am biased because of that, because I make a firm position. So basically, my question is, or my comment is in general, that if you could make comment in terms of how to decolonize the ethics board or the institution itself, which is the gatekeeper of research. Yeah.
First question. Who wants to have a go? The first question. Yes. I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah. Yes, please. Exactly.
So I agree and I disagree with you. So I agree that implicit bias and implicit. So some of my researchers looked at implicit memory, which is the way that we exactly what I was talking about. In fact, that our past affects the way we behave in many situations and the way we respond to things. I agree that it's difficult to undo those things, but I completely disagree that it's impossible because it's the basis for many, many kind of different types of therapy. So I think it's a difficult problem, but it's not impossible. I think the other thing we need to be really careful about with that is the assumption that things are unconscious. So this concept of unconscious bias is being used a lot. And actually, when you ask, people are more conscious of it than they're prepared to admit. So there's many situations where you can test that and you realize that people are not unconscious of it at all. They're just not speaking about it and not acknowledging about it and not reflecting on it. So some of it will be done at a level that's below the level of consciousness, I agree, but I think there's an awful lot of what we're calling unconscious implicit bias that isn't unconscious and that we can address. And what I would say from a memory perspective is that things sit across that spectrum. So sometimes things will be below the threshold of consciousness and sometimes they'll be above it. But pretty much, well, an awful lot of therapy and an awful lot of work we do with people is to try and help people access that stuff that maybe they don't actively reflect on or can't easily access. And I think that's a huge part of this work. So that's my...
Okay, thank you. I just want to go back to your comment about decolonizing the mind. I think, yes, it is a concept coined by Ngugi, the Kenyan activist. And I think I relate to what you say because I'm African. And I think a lot of people sometimes when they ask me where I'm from, and I say I'm from Algeria, and they ask me, oh, why you're not black? I'm African, but I'm not black. And I think there is this deficit narrative that is internalized about Africa. There's so many deficit narratives that we have internalized and accepted as truth. And I think this is where we need to decolonize our mind, because these are all colonial legacies which have been perpetuated in our psyche, consciousness, ideologies, and so on and so forth. This is where the decolonizing the mind comes into play, to challenge that. And that goes back to power, the concept of power, the intersection of power and popular culture, the representation of Africa in scholarly work, social media, media in general, and so on. And this is why, as institutions, as individuals and friends, families and siblings, we need racial literacy. So many people do not have the literacy. That's why they perpetuate perhaps the stereotypes, the racist comments, and so on, the othering, because there is this lack of awareness, lack of literacy, and lack of language. And this is why it is important to engage in these processes of decolonizing the mind through looking at language that we use, and that has an impact on other people. It's not about the intention sometimes. We have all good intentions to do good, to do well, and to respect the others. But the language we use sometimes is problematic. It can have an impact on other people and our students and colleagues. And it goes back to Leon's point about our relationships with one another. So we need to be examining this. And there are ways to do that. There are ways to do that through racial literacy, trainings, private learning, and process of reflexivity as well. Thank you.
And I'll address a couple of points. This is working, yeah. So in terms of the bias part, you're right, and I think Catherine has already addressed in terms of a lot of people have bias. We have biases, but that does not mean that should govern. It can govern our immediate personal interaction, reaction to something, but it does not and should not govern our politics. And that's the whole point of being in public life, is right. I might think that, he's fine, you're not fine based on certain stereotypes, but when we interact, one has to be open to learning about it. And I do think societies, if you look at it, stereotypes get challenged, biases get challenged, and we need to move beyond whatever biases we have, because that's a constant struggle, but we do it. I think public life is all about it. In terms of the question about what impact, let's say, decolonizing or efforts to decolonize curriculum is having, one, my reading again is that it's patchy, it depends, number one. Number two, it does create space for conversations like this. It does create more space for this being integral part of curriculum, but also what students learn. So students can't then go and say, oh, I have never heard of even Africa. We used to have that in the past, by the way, right? But at least that's improving. Now, what actual impact it's having on life and career of people, that we don't know. It's too early to say, in my view, in terms of the recent phase of decolonizing curriculum, by the way. This is a recent one. The previous ones where we would talk of critical education and other kinds of education, that's different. But in any case, when we're talking about decolonizing mind, institutions, this is a long-term battle we are fighting. So we have to wait and see. That doesn't mean we have to be patient. We can be impatient, but we need to recognize that we are in the long haul. It's not going to lead to some change immediately. The question of the ethics process and everything, I'd be really grateful. It's like expense claim form. If you've ever filled expense claim form in any institution, I was tweeting today, I wish there's a new AI app that tells you how to do expense claim form in 5 minutes rather than 5 hours, right? So something similar to ethics. I have not come across a single academic from any university who's satisfied with how ethics process takes place. But there's a major problem. Of course, there's a whole idea of, in psychology, health sciences, there's a sense other kinds of matters. In the kind of work, at least I do in politics, IR, sociology, it might be different. Even when you're not dealing with vulnerable people, there's so much, this lack of understanding of different contexts is very high. So the answers can sometimes be, let's say you want to work on certain groups in Kenya, you want to travel. You've been to Kenya, you go there, or let's say you want to work in Kashmir, Indian-occupied Kashmir. You are a Kashmiri yourself, you've been there, you'll be asked questions like, okay, so which car are you going to drive? Does it have insurance? Can you ask, many universities have been asking, during pandemic and after pandemic, what measures are taking place in the institution you'll go to, and can you get a proof of that? No one is going to send that to you. Or who will protect you? Now imagine, Kashmir, the main violence that Kashmir faces from Indian state, but the expectation of institution is, you get police to help you if there's a problem. When police is the one that's actually oppressing you, how will you get permission from them? What happens? Most research on Kashmir kind of work it's largely derivative. largely without ethnography, because you can't do ethnography even though you're from there. So that's a whole process. I haven't found an answer, and I know I'm not giving an answer to you, but what it does require is sensitization. What does it require, and I would say use the word diversity here, that you need a panel, or you need panels which is much more diverse and understand different contexts, right? Yeah. Without that, it would not happen. Yeah. And I did want to make a comment about the painting which you pointed. You're right. I mean, I use this in my teaching because I teach, this is my favorite room. It depends on which painting you look at. So you do find women here and there, very few. I haven't come across, let's say, non-white people, but there's some painting that will reflect a middle class, upper class, but generally paintings reflect, some of them, the workers. But from 1830s onwards, when this institution was founded, it was Polytechnic. So we are the oldest new university. Right? So Polytechnic, there was a strong emphasis on educating the well, I'm using the word working class, I don't know what word they use, but that has been there. So it has been much different from, and I've seen in other, I don't know about Liverpool, Cambridge, Oxford, King's College, LSE, very different. So one has to always therefore look at more paintings than this. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I will admire the paintings and celebrate them after the event. I have something to say to all of the questions, but of course there's not enough time, so I'm not going to do that. But if anybody who asked very valuable questions wants to speak to me later, please speak to me. I just want to say something about implicit bias, because it's very dangerous, if I can just be blunt with you, because obviously if we go down this route of saying that people have implicit bias or unconscious bias, whatever you're using, and it's somehow ingrained with them to the extent that they can't change their perspective, it doesn't leave us with much hope for change. It reminds me of a friend who suffers from kind of depressive symptoms, and I was speaking to them and they said to me, well, you know, it's just the way I am, it's just who I am, and I'm just like, I've always been like this and I'm going to be like that. And I said, do you know what? I said, I don't agree with that. And do you know why I don't agree with that? Because psychology, and I'm not a psychologist, I'm not an expert in this, but psychology, if I can be bold enough to say this, is a discipline which, whether psychologists will not agree with this, but as a sociologist, I'm going to say it anyway, is a discipline which is on many occasions culturally biased and subjective in the conclusions that it reaches. I know psychologists won't always agree with this, but I have to say this. I'm very passionate about this, and maybe this is a different topic. But I was trying to explain to this person that the science, yeah, because science is used very loosely in psychology, the science of whether people are innately depressive or have the potential to be not depressive and have the potential and are shaped by their environment and their experiences is very shaky and it's very vague. Psychologists might not agree with that, by the way. So let's just be clear that this is my understanding. So I said to that person, why don't you, because there's different opinions about this, why don't you take the more optimistic opinion and say, no, I can change my outlook and I can find coping strategies and I can find a better way of looking at life and coping with life and I can overcome these challenges as other people have said to do that. So this also is important because what you make me think about is the very idea of, you know, using alternative cosmologies, as they call it, or alternative, let's say, narratives or discourses. So for me, like, I'm kind of influenced by an Islamic cosmology or Islamic outlook, you can say. And so I'm thinking about this from like an Islamic perspective, like what would Islamic teachings, which has alternative ideas about the self and the mind and about change and about age and about attitudes and so on, what would an Islamic perspective, and I'm like, in Islam, there's no such thing as implicit bias and there's no such thing as somebody being written off and being said that you believe something and you will always remain like that. Instead, there's a different perspective that says no matter what age you are and no matter what stage of life you are, there's always an opportunity for you to learn something, for you to change your perspective. And so this is a good topic for us, I think, to apply decolonization to, because if we assume that implicit bias is a thing, and if we assume that people are, you know, are a foregone conclusion because they're the products of genetics or whatever you call it, we might be, perhaps, I'm not sure because I've not like studied this is just initial thoughts to your interesting comment, we might find that we're actually replicating a very Eurocentric perspective based on a very Eurocentric concept, which in other cosmologies or other outlooks might not be applicable. So I find it unsatisfying or dissatisfying to say that people can't change because I wouldn't like to conclude that about myself. I wouldn't, because we all have these biases and prejudices. I'm not like open-minded and like, totally cool, and I've got my own like issues and, inadequacies, and I'm not going to conclude that whatever these weaknesses or shortcomings or, things that I haven't been able to see yet are going to remain with me. I'm going to try and find ways to overcome that, and I think we've all done that. Like, weren't we all a bit violent in the playground? Didn't we all say nasty words to our friends as children, and didn't we all learn to mature and to find ways of regulating ourselves? Like the things I did as a teenager, I wouldn't do that now, because I've learned that you don't really behave like that with people, because I've learned that there's something called hurt, and there's something called injury, and there's something desirable about trying to be gentle. And I'm not gentle all the time with everyone in every occasion, but I'm trying, and I think we can all make progress. And so I think we should, I personally, and you might see it otherwise, but I personally want to strongly reject the idea that whether someone is of an old age or very ingrained in their ways, that means a racist is always going to be a racist, because some people do have that perspective that it's kind of human nature to be racist in a way, if I can simplify it, because they believe that you're naturally, like xenophobia, some people would say, is a natural human instinct. But the interesting thing about this, which shows me that it's not a natural human instinct, is that xenophobia or racism or prejudice is always defined from a socially constructed way. And what do I mean by that? I mean that, for example, when we have those biases, when we exhibit our xenophobia, we do it through socially determined lenses. Let me try and say it in a third way. When we are racist, we do it on the basis of historical constructs that didn't have to be seen that way. So just to give you an example to try and make this clear, because it's very unclear, I'm sorry. The point is that when we see whiteness and blackness, we don't see whiteness and blackness because whiteness and blackness exists. We see it because it's been constructed and we've been made to see it. So for example, in the UK, we don't see dark hair and light hair and feel implicit bias, because it's not socially constructed in a hierarchical way. I mean, to some extent it is, there are stereotypes and all these kind of things, but generally we don't notice hair color like that, I think. I mean, this is my opinion, perspective, I might be wrong, this is how I understand it. We don't see eye color. Like if someone's white with brown eyes or white with blue eyes, it's not like, oh my God, this is the blue eyes, I want to speak to the person with the blue eyes, because we're not socially constructed. The earlobe, some people's earlobe is like hanging and some is not hanging. We don't see that because we're not taught to see that. So if implicit bias was a natural human nature, if it was something deeply ingrained in us, wouldn't we see height and eye color and hair color and earlobe and nose shape and think, I have to be friends with the person with a certain shape of face? We don't see these things because historically there was no historical intervention that told us this one is better than that one. These people are more human and these people are more dehumanized or closer to animals. These people are more intellectual. These people have been saved and these people have been damned to whatever afterlife awaits them. But that is what happened with things like race. And that shows me that race is not something that needs to be seen. It's not something that is inherently seen. It's seen because we've been taught to see it. History has taught us to see it. And we could have lived in a world, and to some extent we do live in a world, where we didn't need to see race because we don't always see ethnicity. White people or whiteness is not consistent. Like the people who get put in the category of white can look very different, and the people who get put in the category of black can also look very different. There's no tangible way of identifying whiteness or blackness. It's a very socially constructed, superficial concept, and that's why for me, in my biased sociological perspective, disciplines like psychology can't talk about these things unless they're prepared to talk about the sociological dimension, because if you just try to individualize it on the level of the psyche, you might end up overlooking the historical context which created the frameworks that you're trying to measure. I hope that's clear. And I'm sorry for the other questions.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I think this last sentence referred to Fanon, which we have discussed in the past, and Fanon's perspective on coloniality and so on. This was implicit here. Just very briefly, we started the proceedings asking questions about what is decolonization, does it deliver or disappoint? I think we have covered the first bit in terms of different forms of definitions, different perspectives that are offered by the
member of the panel here, but we also covered the second part. Yes, it does deliver, because we are the fact that we are having a conversation here, and what the different members of different panel, the members of panels have said about decolonization itself really is a way forward in terms of this is an ongoing process. And for that reason, we are really thinking that this does deliver. But there is some connotation of disappointing, because I think that we need to leave the gated communities of universities and go a little bit forward in terms of reaching out to the communities and making sure that people fully understand what decolonization and coloniality and what is decolonization. It reaches the ordinary person in the street. I'd like to end that. I'd like to thank the member of the panels here. There was a wonderful discussion here. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for being here and making this occasion a very wonderful occasion for me personally, because I feel very passionate about this discussion. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.